The morning sun over western Russia cast long shadows across the fields as the German invasion pushed deeper into Soviet territory. In June 1941, confidence filled the air. The Wehrmacht had crushed every opponent placed before it: Poland, France, the Low Countries, Yugoslavia. German tank crews believed they were the best in the world, commanding machines superior in engineering, speed, and firepower. Their Panzer IIIs and IVs had rolled across Europe almost unopposed. Now, as they pressed toward Minsk and Smolensk, they expected the same outcome. At a crossroads outside the village of Borisov, a German anti-tank crew set up their familiar 37mm pack gun, the door knocker, as soldiers jokingly called it. The men were relaxed, almost casual, scanning the fields for the clumsy Soviet armor they had been told to expect. Reports of a new Russian tank had circulated among the ranks, but no one took them seriously. German officers dismissed the stories as Soviet propaganda. Whatever the Red Army fielded, they believed, would break, just like everything else. Then dust rose on the horizon. At first, the shapes were indistinct. Dark, broad, low to the ground. The gun crew snapped to attention. "Tanks! Approaching!" The commander shouted orders. The crew adjusted the gun's sights, loaded a round, and waited for the silhouettes to clarify. They did, and the Germans blinked in disbelief. These were not the boxy, lightly armored Soviet T-26 they knew. These machines had sloped hulls, thick angled armor, and turrets shaped like blunt hammers. And they were moving fast, far faster than any heavy tank should. The gun commander hesitated, just for a moment, before ordering the shot. The 37mm round streaked across the field and hit the lead Soviet tank square on the hull. It bounced. Not a dent, not even a spark big enough to matter. The shell ricocheted upward into the sky like it had struck a steel pyramid. The German crew froze. The tank did not even slow down. It came on, engine roaring, tracks chewing the earth in great gouts of dirt. The gunner fired again. Another ricochet. Panic rippled through the line. More Soviet tanks emerged from the dust. 10, then 20, then more, and suddenly the German soldiers understood something chilling. Their guns could not kill this machine. The myth of German invincibility cracked in that moment, shattered by a tank they had dismissed as impossible. A tank called the T-34. In the years before the German invasion, few outside the Soviet Union understood how radically different its emerging tank designs were from anything in the West. The T-26 and BT series had given foreign observers a false sense of Soviet tank philosophy. Light armor, fast movement, but nothing remarkable. German analysts studied these early models and concluded that Russia lacked the industrial capacity and engineering skill to produce anything truly threatening. What they didn't know was that deep inside the design bureaus of Kharkov, a revolution was taking shape. Mikhail Koshkin, a quiet, relentless engineer, believed that armored warfare needed to evolve. He had studied the failures of early tanks in Spain and the harsh landscapes of Eastern Europe. He understood something the Germans had not yet realized. The next war would not be won with elegant machines built for good weather and good roads. It would be fought in mud, snow, and brutal conditions where reliability mattered more than refinement. A tank had to survive the environment long enough to fight the enemy. Koshkin assembled a team of designers who dared to break the rules. They angled the armor, something most nations had dismissed as unnecessary. They widened the tracks to spread the tank's weight, giving it unmatched mobility through mud and snow. They chose a diesel engine, not gasoline, for safety and efficiency, even though it complicated production. They insisted on a powerful 76mm gun that could kill any known tank at long range. The result was a machine that looked strange, almost crude to Western eyes. But underneath the rough finish was a masterpiece of ballistic logic. The first prototypes rolled out in 1940. Early tests were a mix of triumph and frustration. The engine overheated, the transmission groaned. The crew complained about cramped space and poor visibility. Yet every time testers fired at the sloped armor, the rounds bounced harmlessly away. Every time the tank maneuvered through swamps or steep inclines, its wide tracks carried it with surprising ease. Koshkin pushed the prototypes to the limit, driving one of them on a grueling trek from Kharkov to Moscow and back, over 2,000 miles, to prove the design's durability. Exhausted and ill, he completed the journey, but the toll on his health was severe. He would die shortly afterward, never seeing his creation become one of the most influential tanks in history. As Europe descended into war, Soviet leaders scrambled to modernize their armored forces. The T-34 was approved for production, but the Soviet industrial base was strained. Factories had to retool, workers had to learn new techniques. Even so, the Soviets pressed forward, driven by a sense of urgency they couldn't yet explain. When the first T-34 units rolled off the assembly line, many inside the Red Army were unimpressed by its rough construction. Welds were ugly, optics were inferior, ergonomics were poor. But none of that mattered. The armor was strong, the gun was deadly, and the tank could go almost anywhere. What no one realized in those early months was that this machine, this strange, sloped, unrefined creation, would upend every assumption the Germans held about armored warfare. Germany believed the Soviets were backward. Germany believed their tanks were superior. Germany believed victory was inevitable. The T-34 was about to prove all three beliefs disastrously wrong. By the time the German army surged across the border in June 1941, the T-34 existed in only modest numbers. Even Soviet commanders were still learning how to use it. Most German officers didn't even know it existed. Their intelligence summaries estimated the Red Army's armor consisted mostly of outdated light tanks, poorly built and poorly led. For the first weeks of the campaign, evidence seemed to confirm that assumption. Hundreds of Soviet vehicles lay burning along the roads, wrecked by German speed, tactics, and superior coordination. But beneath the chaos, something was changing. In scattered sectors, German units began reporting encounters with a new type of tank, one faster than expected, tougher than anything they'd seen, able to appear suddenly from woods or ravines and tear into their columns before disappearing again. At first, these reports were dismissed as misidentifications or exaggerations. Then more arrived, and more. And with each one, a pattern began to form. The T-34 was not a curiosity, it was a shockwave rolling west. By late summer, German engineers studying wrecked T-34s were stunned. They examined the hull angles, the thickness of the plates, the simplicity of the internal systems. From the moment a German officer touched the tank's cold steel, he understood why their shells had struggled. Armor laid back at steep angles dramatically increased effective thickness. It wasn't magic, it was geometry, weaponized. What the Germans had taken for brutish, unsophisticated design was in fact ingenious. Sloping meant more survivability for less weight. Every hit that didn't penetrate gave the tank one more moment of life to fight. As 1941 drew to a close, the evolution began. Soviet factories, some of them packed onto trains and relocated thousands of miles east to the Urals, began producing T-34s at a rate the Germans couldn't comprehend. Assemblies that would have taken weeks in German plants were completed in days in improvised Soviet facilities. Quality was uneven, welding was inconsistent, but the tanks rolled out in staggering numbers, and each year the design improved. 1942 saw the emergence of better armor treatments and incremental fixes to engine reliability. 1943 brought more refined versions of the 76mm gun, thicker armor sections, and efforts to standardize production despite wartime chaos. Then came the breakthrough, the T-34-85. A new turret with 3 crewmen instead of 2. Better optics. A powerful 85mm gun capable of fighting Germany's newer armored threats. And still, the tank remained cheap, rugged, and fast to build. These improvements didn't happen in isolation. They mirrored a growing Soviet understanding of how to wage deep, mechanized warfare at massive scale. The Red Army didn't need a perfect tank. It needed a tank that could be built by the thousands, survive harsh climates, maneuver across frozen rivers and endless mud, and defeat enemy armor through a combination of numbers, firepower, and resilience. German industry tried to keep pace. The Panzer III received new guns. The Panzer IV added thicker armor and a long 75mm gun. But every German improvement came with cost, more machining, more complexity, more delays. Meanwhile, every Soviet improvement was designed for speed of production. Where Germany crafted tanks like fine machinery, the Soviet Union stamped them like tools, basic, strong, and replaceable. By 1943, the evolution of the T-34 had shaped everything around it. German engineers scrambled to create counters, culminating in the Panther, a tank explicitly designed as a response to the T-34's sloped armor. The Tiger followed a different philosophy, brute force and thick plating. Both were formidable, both terrified Soviet crews, but both also took too long to build, consumed too many resources, and broke too often in harsh terrain. The T-34 didn't need perfection to win. It needed survival, it needed mobility, it needed firepower, and above all, it needed to exist in numbers beyond anything the Germans could stop. By the middle of the war, that is exactly what it was becoming. A tide of steel rolling across the Eastern Front, growing with every month, every factory shift, every desperate Soviet push. Germany's early overconfidence was evaporating. They had entered Russia believing the Red Army was a broken force. Instead, they found themselves facing a tank whose evolution was rapid, unstoppable, and increasingly decisive. The T-34 was no longer a surprise. It was becoming the center of gravity of the entire conflict. The T-34 was about to prove all three beliefs disastrously wrong. The first months of the invasion had been a parade of German victories, but beneath that momentum ran a growing unease. Something was wrong with the enemy's armor. Panzer commanders who had once joked about Soviet machines now sent urgent, frustrated reports up the chain of command. Their shots were failing. Their anti-tank guns were failing. The terrain that had once favored their maneuvers was now working against them because the T-34 seemed to glide over obstacles that bogged down German vehicles. The turning points came not all at once, but as a series of shocks, each one cracking the facade of German superiority. The earliest came near Dubno, during the massive tank battles of the summer of 1941. German forces encountered hundreds of T-34s and KV heavy tanks. Though poorly coordinated, these Soviet units inflicted losses the Germans had never anticipated. Reports described shells bouncing harmlessly off sloped armor, panzers forced into dangerous flanking maneuvers, and surprise attacks where T-34s crashed through forests thought impassable. One officer wrote bitterly that their 37mm guns were as useless as umbrellas. Another turning point unfolded that same year near Minsk, where Colonel Mikhail Katukov orchestrated a masterclass in defensive tank warfare. Guderian's armoured spearhead, which had cut through Poland and France with ruthless efficiency, suddenly found itself ambushed by T-34s concealed in forests and gullies. The Soviet tanks struck quickly, used terrain expertly, and vanished before German forces could respond. Guderian himself admitted that German armour could not match the T-34 in speed, firepower, or protection. It was a sobering revelation. But the psychological turning point, the moment when German soldiers collectively realized the T-34 was a different kind of enemy, occurred during the winter of 1941-42. The cold descended with a brutality the Wehrmacht had not prepared for. Lubricants froze, engines refused to start, tracks cracked in the sub-zero temperatures. German tanks that had rolled gloriously across France now sat immobilized in snowdrifts, their engines sputtering, their crews shivering. And then, as if born from the storm itself, the T-34s emerged. Their diesel engines roared flawlessly in the icy air. Their wide tracks floated atop snow where German tanks sank. Their crews lit fires beneath the hulls to warm themselves, secure in the knowledge that the diesel would not ignite. German crews watched in disbelief as the Soviet tanks maneuvered in conditions that left their own machines paralyzed. One panzer officer scribbled in his diary, "We are no longer fighting men, we are fighting climate and steel." As 1942 progressed, German high command scrambled to respond. New weapons were rushed to the front. The Pat-40 anti-tank gun, with far greater penetration, began arriving in limited numbers. But until those guns became widespread, German units were forced to rely on desperate measures. Close-range shots into tracks, flanking maneuvers under fire, or calling for air support. Even infantry were instructed to use magnetic mines and grenades, often at suicidal distances. Every solution felt temporary. The Soviets, meanwhile, were learning. Their crews refined their tactics. their factories perfected rapid production methods. Each month brought more T-34s to the front. What had once been isolated, frightening encounters became waves, units rolling forward in battalion strength, then regiment strength, then entire brigades sweeping across fields where German armor had once operated without fear. German soldiers who had spent years believing in the superiority of their equipment now found themselves improvising under fire. A panzer commander near Voronezh recounted watching a T-34 take 5 direct hits from his own gun before rolling to a stop. "It was like trying to kill a bull with stones," he said, and there were more of them behind it. Another turning point came with the development of German heavy tanks, the Panther and Tiger, both conceived as answers to the T-34. They were deadly machines, technologically advanced, terrifying when functioning properly. Yet they were also expensive, complex, and mechanically fragile. Panthers broke down in the first hours of Kursk. Tigers consumed fuel the army couldn't supply. For every Panther or Tiger produced, the Soviets produced several T-34s. Germany was trying to match innovation with engineering perfection. The Soviets countered with relentless, unstoppable production. By 1943, the German perspective had changed completely. Officers who once mocked Soviet armor now briefed their men with grim seriousness. The T-34 was not a primitive machine. It was not a fluke. It was not going away. It was the backbone of the Red Army. It was the engine of Soviet resilience. It was the steel tide that would eventually reach Berlin. And the Germans knew it. Germany's early overconfidence was evaporating. They had entered Russia believing the Red Army was a broken force. Instead, they found themselves facing a tank whose evolution was rapid, unstoppable, and increasingly decisive. The T-34 was no longer a surprise. It was becoming the center of gravity of the entire conflict. The T-34 was about to prove all 3 beliefs disastrously wrong. The first great clash that truly revealed what the T-34 could do came in the thick forests and rolling hills near Mtsensk. It was October 1941. And the Germans were pushing hard toward Moscow. Their confidence was still intact, despite scattered encounters with the new Soviet tanks. But when Guderian's armored spearhead reached the Oryol-Mtsensk sector, they found themselves entering ground perfect for ambushes. Dense woods, ravines, and narrow roads that funneled German vehicles into columns. Kol Mikhail Katukov, commanding the 4th Tank Brigade, understood this terrain as if he had grown from it. His T-34 crews were few, undertrained, and undersupplied, but their machines had qualities the Germans hadn't yet grasped. Katukov used the land like a weapon. He positioned his tanks behind ridges, inside tree lines, and beside hidden marshland. He ordered them to hold fire until the Germans were at point-blank range. When the first German column rolled into the kill zone, the ambush detonated like a clap of thunder. A T-34 erupted from the tree line, smashing through brush and fallen logs as though they were twigs. German gunners swiveled their turrets, stunned by the speed of the Soviet machine. The T-34 fired, its 76.2mm round, piercing the lead Panzer III and sending it burning into the ditch. Before the Germans could respond, another T-34 struck the column from the flank, tearing open a Panzer IV with a single shot. Chaos engulfed the road. Engines snarled, tracks ground against one another, and panic rippled through crews who suddenly realized their armor was not enough. German shells clanged and sparked as they struck the T-34's sloped hulls, ricocheting like pebbles off a boulder. One panzer commander later wrote, "It was like firing at a phantom. We hit it again and again, and it did not die." The T-34s dove back into the forest, disappearing as quickly as they had appeared. Guderian's advance stalled for the first time since the invasion began. In the days that followed, Katukov repeated the tactic over and over. His tanks would strike, vanish, and strike again. German frustration grew. Their 37mm guns were useless. Their short 75mm guns struggled. Even their tactics, flanking maneuvers, coordinated barrages, seemed powerless against the Soviet machine's ability to appear and disappear like predators of the forest. For Guderian, this was the first undeniable proof. The T-34 was superior. While the battle near Mtsensk shocked German commanders, the winter of 1941-42 devastated German soldiers. Frozen oil thickened like tar. Engines cracked from the cold. Tanks became immobile lumps of steel anchored helplessly in the snow. German crews wrapped rags around their boots and hands, desperate to keep frostbite at bay. Then, the Soviets attacked. T-34s rolled forward across frozen fields where German tanks floundered. Their diesel engines started in the bitter cold with far fewer problems. Their wide tracks spread the tank's weight across deep snow, allowing for mobility the Germans simply could not match. A Soviet crewman later said, "The snow was our armor, the T-34 was our horse." German soldiers watched in disbelief as Soviet armor moved through drifts waist-high to a man. One German gunner tried to engage a lone T-34 approaching through snow that would have swallowed any panzer. He fired repeatedly. Every shot bounced off. The tank returned fire only once. The German position ceased to exist. Stories spread rapidly through German units. Some were exaggerated, but others were painfully true. A T-34 had advanced through a blizzard, firing steadily, while 20 German shells struck it to no effect. Another had lost a track to a mine, yet its turret kept rotating and firing, holding up an entire German company for hours. A disabled T-34 in one village reportedly absorbed 15 direct hits, and when German infantry approached, the turret suddenly snapped toward them. The gun fired. The tank was still alive. Beyond pure combat effectiveness, the T-34 inspired stories of almost supernatural resilience. During a chaotic retreat, a Soviet crew abandoned their tank after it became stuck in a ditch. The Germans, eager to study it, attempted to drag it away with 2 Panzer IIIs. The T-34 barely budged. Its weight, its position, and its deep-set tracks made it feel rooted to the earth. The Germans eventually succeeded, but not before the abandoned tank's engine roared to life. The Soviet crew had returned. The Germans scattered as the T-34 lurched forward, smashing one panzer and sending the other fleeing in panic. Such tales fed into a growing mythos among Soviet soldiers. To them, the T-34 was not just a machine, it was a symbol, a guardian of the motherland, forged in factories moved by hand across thousands of miles, built by workers who lived on the edge of starvation, yet produced miracles daily. Many crews gave their tanks names: the Avenger, Red Dawn, Mother's Wrath. Some painted inscriptions on the turrets: for Moscow, for our families, for victory. But the T-34 was not invincible. German engineers were not idle. As 1942 progressed, the Park 40 anti-tank gun appeared in greater numbers. Its long-barreled 75mm rounds could penetrate the T-34's armor, at close range, from the right angle, and with a steady hand. German infantry adapted, using terrain and coordinated fire to disable tracks or jam turrets. Still, even when the T-34 was vulnerable, killing it was not easy. One German soldier recalled encountering a disabled T-34 blocking a village road. The crew was dead, the turret split open by a direct hit. Yet the Germans struggled to move it. Their half-tracks strained, their cables snapped. The tank, even in death, refused to yield. The war changed again at Kharkov, where Soviet forces launched desperate counterattacks in 1942. T-34s came in waves, poorly coordinated, often charging without infantry support, sometimes crewed by men with only a few days of training. German gunners learned to exploit these chaotic assaults, knocking out tank after tank with concentrated fire. But even here, the T-34 left its mark. German soldiers described scenes where a T-34, even after being hit repeatedly, continued to move, turrets swinging wildly as if defying death itself. One tank reportedly charged through a burning street, its engine aflame, its tracks shedding plates, before finally exploding in a blast so powerful it rocked German positions hundreds of meters away. Then came Kursk. It was here, in the summer of 1943, that the T-34's story reached its epic moment. The Soviets had prepared for months, building deep defensive belts, planting mines by the millions, and positioning their T-34s to both defend and counterattack. Germany brought its newest creations: Panthers, Tigers, Ferdinand tank destroyers, machines designed specifically to defeat Soviet armor. The battlefield became a crucible of fire and steel. On the plains near Prokhorovka, T-34s charged across open ground toward German positions. The air was thick with smoke and dust. Panthers fired from long distances, their rounds punching through T-34 hulls with terrifying precision. But the Soviet tanks kept coming. A German officer watching the charge later wrote, "They advanced as if they were endless. Some T-34s rammed Panthers head-on. Others closed the distance to use their mobility where German long-range guns were less effective. Soviet crews bailed from burning tanks and climbed into fresh ones. A sergeant recalled being thrown from his vehicle by an explosion, only to climb into a damaged T-34 nearby and continue the attack with its wounded crew. In one extraordinary account, a T-34 took a direct hit that blew open its turret ring. The crew inside was injured but alive. Instead of retreating, they crawled out, flagged down another tank, and rode on its hull into battle. Hours later, they found another disabled T-34, repaired its track with parts scavenged under fire, and drove that tank back into combat. Kursk was not a victory of technology alone. It was a victory of endurance, production, determination. The Germans destroyed thousands of Soviet tanks, but the Soviets brought more, and more, and more. The T-34 was not designed to be perfect, it was designed to be unstoppable. As Soviet forces pushed west in 1944, the T-34-85 entered the battlefield. Its upgraded gun could now pierce the armor of Panthers and even threaten Tigers at closer ranges. German tank aces who once had dominated the battlefield now found themselves facing swarms of faster, more maneuverable opponents. They might destroy 5, 10, even 20 T-34s in a day. But eventually, ammunition ran out. Fuel dwindled, engines overheated, and the Soviet advance continued. One German Tiger commander described watching a column of T-34s crest a ridge at sunset. His crew began firing immediately, knocking out the first 2 tanks. But instead of halting, the T-34s fanned out across the field, moving with a cohesion that stunned him. It was as if the land itself was advancing, he wrote. His Tiger destroyed 8 T-34s before running low on shells. As he attempted to withdraw, a T-34 struck from the flank, its 85mm round hitting the rear of the Tiger's turret. The German tank burned, its crew barely escaping. As the commander fled on foot, he looked back and saw more T-34s pouring over the ridge. He later said, "I had never seen such numbers. We were drowning in them." These human stories, ambushes, duels, desperate counterattacks, tanks burning through the night, paint a portrait not of a perfect machine, but of a machine perfectly suited for the war it fought. The T-34 was brutal, crude, rugged. It killed and was killed. It suffered and survived. It demanded bravery from its crews, many of whom died inside its steel belly. But battle after battle, year after year, it showed why the Germans had been wrong to dismiss it. It was not a primitive tank. It was a revolution, one that reshaped the largest land war in history. By 1943, the German perspective had changed completely. Officers who once mocked Soviet armor now briefed their men with grim seriousness. The T-34 was not a primitive machine. It was not a fluke. It was not going away. It was the backbone of the Red Army. It was the engine of Soviet resilience. It was the steel tide that would eventually reach Berlin. And the Germans knew it. Germany's early overconfidence was evaporating. They had entered Russia believing the Red Army was a broken force. Instead, they found themselves facing a tank whose evolution was rapid, unstoppable, and increasingly decisive. The T-34 was no longer a surprise. It was becoming the center of gravity of the entire conflict. The T-34 was about to prove all 3 beliefs disastrously wrong. German column, firing into vehicles with terrifying calm. Soldiers scattered like leaves. The tank didn't attempt to chase them. It simply advanced, shooting anything that moved. "I had never seen panic like that," he said. "It was as if the tank was the judgment of God." Even more unsettling was the T-34's endurance. Damaged tanks that should have been abandoned somehow returned to battle later the same day. German patrols reported seeing the same scarred T-34s multiple times across different sectors, patched crudely, but still fighting. This gave rise to the myth that the Soviets had steel ghosts, tanks that died and rose again. For Soviet crews, The psychology ran in the opposite direction. The T-34 gave them confidence no earlier machine had provided. Veterans recalled the feeling of shells bouncing harmlessly off the armor. The tank shook, rang like a bell, and kept going. "We believed in our machine," one Soviet gunner said. "If we could close the distance, we would win." Many crews described moments where their tank had been hit multiple times, yet the interior remained intact and spirits stayed high. The armor was not just protection, it was morale. This contrast in experience widened as the war dragged on. To German soldiers, the T-34 became a symbol of an enemy that refused to break. To Soviet soldiers, it became a companion, a harsh, unforgiving companion, but one that watched over them in the worst conditions of war. By 1943, psychological reports within the Wehrmacht openly acknowledged the growing dread surrounding the T-34. The shape of its silhouette in the distance caused hesitation. The grinding of its tracks in the night caused unrest. The knowledge that more were always coming caused despair. It wasn't just the tank that broke German morale. It was the realization that the Soviets had built a weapon designed to outlast fear itself. The T-34 did more than win duels on the battlefield. It reshaped the very strategy of the war. When German commanders first encountered it, their instinct was to treat it as an isolated anomaly, a rare heavy tank, dangerous but manageable. But as months passed and reports multiplied, the truth became impossible to ignore. This was not a specialty weapon, it was the backbone of the Red Army, and its design philosophy threatened the foundation of German armored doctrine. Up to 1941, German tanks were built around precision engineering. They were balanced, reliable, and well coordinated with infantry. But they were also products of a system that prized technical sophistication and craftsmanship. The Soviets, in contrast, forged the T-34 out of brutal necessity. They emphasized speed of production, ruggedness, and the ability to function with minimal maintenance in unforgiving conditions. The two philosophies collided with enormous consequences. German industry reacted first through improvisation. Panzer IIIs received longer guns, Panzer IVs thicker armor. But each improvement added weight, cost, and mechanical strain. For every upgraded Panzer that rolled off the line, the Soviets produced dozens of T-34s. And while German tanks required expert mechanics and precision-machined components, the T-34 could be repaired in the field with a hammer, welding torch, or salvaged parts from another destroyed tank. The disparity widened further when Soviet factories were relocated east of the Ural Mountains. Entire tank plants, machinery, workers, blueprints were loaded onto trains, moved thousands of miles, and rebuilt in months. It was one of the most astonishing industrial feats of the war. Within a year, these relocated factories were producing more T-34s than before, their assembly lines humming around the clock, manned by workers who slept next to their equipment and labored through hunger, cold, and exhaustion. The strategic impact was devastating for Germany. Even when German tanks outperformed the T-34 technically, they could never match its numbers. A Panther might destroy several T-34s in a duel, but its complex engine and drivetrain often failed before it could reach the front. A Tiger might dominate any battlefield it entered, but its fuel consumption was enormous and its maintenance demands staggering. Only 1,347 Tigers were ever built. In contrast, the Soviets produced tens of thousands of T-34s. German generals recognized the imbalance early. Reports to Berlin stressed that Soviet armor production exceeded expectations by orders of magnitude. Field commanders urged Berlin to develop a medium tank modeled on the T-34. This led directly to the Panther, a machine whose sloped armor and long 75mm gun were inspired by the design they once mocked. The irony was unmistakable. The Germans were now copying the Soviets. Even German anti-tank doctrine shifted under the T-34's influence. Early war tactics relying on flanking and precise shots became obsolete. The T-34's mobility and armor forced the Wehrmacht to develop kill zones, stronger defensive belts, and massed anti-tank artillery. In many sectors, German units avoided open battle altogether unless they held overwhelming positional advantage. The T-34 also shaped Soviet operational strategy. Its mobility enabled the deep battle concept, rapid penetrations through enemy lines, exploitation by mechanized corps, and encirclements on a massive scale. When Soviet forces launched their great offensives from 1943 onward, T-34s spearheaded the thrusts, racing across open plains, crossing rivers on improvised bridges, and smashing through German rear areas before defenders could reorganize. This shift altered the tempo of the entire war. German units that had once moved swiftly now found themselves reacting, retreating, improvising. Their operational flexibility, once their greatest strength, was eroded by a machine that allowed the Soviets to dictate the pace of battle. Perhaps the most significant strategic impact was psychological. German commanders began planning defensive lines based not on terrain or logistics, but on the assumption that T-34s would eventually arrive in overwhelming numbers. Their presence shaped every decision, from where to concentrate forces to how long to hold a position. Even Hitler himself, upon seeing a captured T-34, reportedly expressed shock at its design, asking why Germany had not built such a tank. By the last year of the war, the T-34 was no longer a terrifying surprise. It was an inevitability. German soldiers who once scoffed at Soviet machinery now spoke of the tank with a mixture of respect and dread. They had faced it in winter blizzards, in burning wheat fields, in forests thick with smoke and shattered trees. They had watched their best guns ricochet off its armor. They had seen fresh waves of them crest the horizon even after they had knocked out dozens. The T-34 was no longer simply a tank. It was the physical expression of a nation's resolve. For the Soviet Union, the tank became something greater than a weapon. It became a symbol of the people who built it. Factory workers, many of them women, teenagers, and the elderly, labored through nights so cold that metal stuck to their skin. They assembled tanks under air raid sirens, in unheated workshops, by the light of lamps whose oil sometimes froze in the glass. They welded plates with hands numb from cold, hammered steel until their palms bled, and produced machines faster than any enemy could destroy them. Each tank represented a story: a family evacuated east, a foreman who slept in his office, a welder who hadn't seen her husband since the first months of the war. When the T-34 rolled out of the factory doors, it carried these stories with it. Soviet tank crews felt this weight. Many were boys barely out of school. Others were factory workers who had volunteered to fight in the machines they helped build. Some wrote messages on their turrets, names of loved ones, villages lost to the invasion, promises of return. Crews formed bonds not only with each other, but with the tank itself. They spoke to it, patted its armor, thanked it after surviving a battle. They knew its flaws: the cramped interior, the lack of radios in early models, the exhausting manual transmission. But they also knew what mattered most. It moved, it fired, and it survived. And survival was the currency of war. By 1944, as the Red Army drove the Germans westward, the T-34 became the spear at the tip of every major Soviet offensive. In Ukraine, in Belarus, in the Baltics, columns of T-34s advanced in long, roaring lines, turrets swaying slightly with each jolt of the terrain. Villagers emerging from hiding watched these tanks roll by with tears in their eyes. To them, the T-34 meant liberation, proof that the invaders who had burned their homes and taken their families would soon be the ones running. In Poland, German units fell back again and again under the relentless pressure of Soviet armor. Even when the Germans deployed Panthers and Tigers, their commanders found themselves overwhelmed, not just by numbers, but by momentum. The T-34-85, with its new gun and more spacious turret, was a formidable opponent. German tank aces could still destroy many, but they could no longer stem the tide. A duel might end in a Panther's favor, but a duel meant little when 5 more T-34s surrounded it. By the time Soviet forces approached East Prussia and the outskirts of Berlin, the Germans had lost any illusion of stopping the T-34. The once proud Panzerwaffe, victorious in France, feared across Europe, had become a shadow of itself. Fuel shortages crippled operations. Mechanical failures grounded Panthers before they reached battle. Even the mighty Tiger II, a fortress on tracks, was helpless when abandoned due to lack of gasoline. German soldiers watched their technological masterpieces sit silent and cold while T-34s poured through the gaps. In the final assault on Berlin, T-34s filled the city streets. Their engines echoed between shattered buildings. Their tracks ground across rubble from the ruins of a Reich that had once believed itself invincible. German defenders fired Panzerfausts from cellars and windows, destroying many tanks at close range, but for every T-34 that burned, more rolled forward. The tank that had once stunned the Germans in 1941 now closed its iron grip around their capital. When the war ended, the T-34 stood as one of the most consequential machines ever built. It was not perfect, not even close. Its ergonomics were poor. Its early optics were substandard. Its crew conditions were brutal. But none of those flaws mattered in the context of the Eastern Front, where endurance, production, and simplicity outweighed refinement. The Germans learned this lesson too late. In the post-war years, historians and veterans from both sides reflected on the T-34's legacy. German officers admitted that it forced them to rethink armored warfare entirely. Panther designers openly acknowledged that their sloped armor concept was inspired by the Soviet tank's geometry. Field reports from 1941 to 1945 documented the same recurring theme. Courage alone could not overcome a machine built with ruthless logic and national will. Soviet veterans, meanwhile, remembered the T-34 as both protector and tomb. Many crews died inside their tanks, many more survived because of them. The armor that deflected German rounds was also the steel coffin that trapped entire crews when hit. It was a weapon of victory and a symbol of sacrifice. Long after the war, restored T-34s rolled through Red Square in parades, their diesel engines growling just as they had on the battlefields of Kursk, Moscow, and Berlin. Veterans touched the armor with reverence, remembering how that steel had once saved their lives. For German veterans attending joint commemorations, the sight evoked a quieter emotion, a complicated mix of respect, regret, and memory. They understood now what they had not understood in 1941. The T-34 wasn't just another tank. It was an industrial miracle born from desperation, resilience, and a terrifying clarity of purpose. Even today, the silhouette of the T-34 is instantly recognizable. The sloped hull, the rounded turret, the sturdy tracks built for mud and snow. Museums display them with plaques listing statistics, armor thickness, gun caliber, engine output. But those numbers cannot capture the machine's true meaning. They cannot explain how a country on the verge of collapse produced a tank that turned the tide of the largest war in human history. They cannot express what it felt like to fire a round at one and watch it bounce. They cannot convey the sound of 100 T-34s advancing together, a rolling thunder that shook the earth. The German soldiers who belittled it in 1941 learned the truth the hard way. Their best shots bounced harmlessly off its angled plates. Their most advanced tanks came too late. Their confidence dissolved under the crush of its treads. In the end, the T-34 did more than survive. It endured. It advanced. It won. And the war on the Eastern Front was decided beneath the shadow of its sloped armor. This shift altered the tempo of the entire war. German units that had once moved swiftly now found themselves reacting, retreating, improvising. Their operational flexibility, once their greatest strength, was eroded by a machine that allowed the Soviets to dictate the pace of battle. Perhaps the most significant strategic impact was psychological. German commanders began planning defensive lines based not on terrain or logistics, but on the assumption that T-34s would eventually arrive in overwhelming numbers. Their presence shaped every decision, from where to concentrate forces to how long to hold a position. Even Hitler himself, upon seeing a captured T-34, reportedly expressed shock at its design, asking why Germany had not built such a tank.